The Game Boy Advance SP released over 20 years ago as one of the best-selling handhelds in history, and it took all of that time for another company to come in and essentially clone it without many of the flaws you can see in other attempts. This is the RG35XX SP, a heavily inspired clamshell handheld with only a few minor flaws, but it is easily the best handheld that this company has ever made since the RG350 almost 5 years ago. I've had this in my hands for only a few days, but I put together this deep dive first impressions video to give you all you need to know. Spoiler alert, this is one to buy. We're going to kick things off with an unboxing, but full disclaimer, these units are review units that were sent to me by the company. The package that I have comes with a carrying case. If you don't buy this, you may be able to use a GBA SP case that has more space on the inside. If you want to get the best thing that's possible, just get a package that already includes a case. It's not that expensive. The RG SP comes in 4 colors right now, but I fully expect that we will see more if this is popular. Inside we have the SP with some padded foam on the top, and under that we have the user guide, some wipes, a screen protector, and a USB cable. I picked the silver color option because I already have that color on a real GBA SP for comparison later in this video. Let's go over the specs and the pricing. When it comes to the specs, we're rocking the all-winner H700 processor. This has 4 Cortex A53 cores clocked at 1.5 GHz, and it has a Mali G31 MP2 GPU. We have 1 GB of LPDDR4 RAM, 64 GB of SD card storage with a second slot for another card, and a 3.5-inch 480p IPS panel. We also have a 3,300 mAh battery, Wi-Fi 5, and Bluetooth 4.2. When it comes to the price on this, it will be slightly cheaper in the first few days that this is on sale. Promo pricing sets this to $59 without shipping. After that, the price will go up to $65 without shipping. So look for this to set you back around $80 or so at the high end. If you live in a country that has VAT tax, this will be a little higher than that. We'll do more specifically on the hardware on the RG SP, but for this, let's just compare it to a GBA SP since this is a very popular handheld that many people have used and have experience with. And if we look at the profile on both, you can see that the 35XX is slightly bigger than the original. It's also slightly thicker. The top half is thinner than the GBA SP, but the bottom is a bit chunkier, which makes sense because there's a much bigger processor in here than the one that's inside the SP. A lot of the styling is also the same. The shoulder buttons are basically the same, with L2 and R2 carrying over from the stock buttons. You can kind of imagine that this is what they would have looked like if the GBA SP had them. We are missing a few other retro elements like the power switch on the side and the volume slider. I think the slider could have worked out well on this clone. The RG SP doesn't have a cartridge slot like the original, but it does have 2 SD card slots in the front with a 3.5mm headphone jack. That last one is nice to see. I did the first episode in my Still Awesomin' series with the GBA SP in 2021 using this Silver IQ version of the SP. I think Anbernic did a pretty good job of recreating this paint for this silver color. The surface texture on this feels a bit more rough than it does on the GBA SP, and it also feels a bit different than other SP shells that I've used. But a lot of the other important details were carried over pretty faithfully on this. And if you've used a GBA SP before, this one is going to feel pretty familiar to you. We'll talk more about the controls in just a second, but I did just want to talk about the differences between the size of the buttons here. You'll see that the D-pad style is pretty much a 1-to-1 clone, as are the face buttons, but the measurements are different. If we measure the stock D-pad, that comes in at around 13mm, with the RG SP coming in at a bit higher than that at around 16.5. The face buttons appear to be a bit smaller, around 2.5mm on the RG SP. One thing that I was able to notice from my use so far is that these buttons really have a pretty shallow throw because they use micro switches, so the height from the top to the bottom of the shell is pretty insignificant. But on this, there's a bigger travel distance. You can see that the D-pad is sticking out much higher on this, and that kind of makes me feel like this entire thing could have been thinner than it is right now, which is kind of a missed opportunity. We would need to do a full teardown to check and see, but it seems like the bottom half of this could have been a bit thinner than it is if they would have gone with thinner buttons. And that just leaves us with the display. Obviously, this is not a 3x2 display like the original. If you're only interested in playing GBA games, they have an overlay applied by default that essentially turns the screen into a 3x2 panel with the GBA logo on the bottom. The image that you're left with for games holds up very well compared to original hardware, especially if you do not own an AGS 101 screen like I have here. Here's some close-up shots of both. There's a color-corrected mode in RA for GBA games that seems to be a bit overkill for this. The stock look is more than adequate. Now it's time to do a deep dive just on the hardware. This is going to be a big section. We're going to talk about the buttons, the screen, and the I/O features that this has. We're going to start off by talking about the buttons. So as I mentioned in that previous section, the SP uses micro switches, and the same is true for the RG SP. The biggest difference between them is how much travel these new buttons have when you use them. If you press the button enough to make them click, it doesn't move that far, but it can go down much further than this because the rubber pad that they're using seems to be pretty thick. It also requires more force to press this button. This is only really a problem if you're very familiar with the feeling of the GBA SP. It is not really anything that is too big of a problem, and I know this is something that can be addressed with DIY down the line. Anbernic could also fix this and the stiffness of this button by just changing their rubber formula. It's very easy to do. On the back of the console, we have dual shoulder buttons. L1 and R1 are very good, and I feel like they did a very good job with the positioning on the other two. Anbernic has a tendency to mess up their R2 and L2 buttons by making them too small for their cases. It's not as bad on the RG SP as it is on their other recent offerings, but it does exist here. You can see this problem as I'm holding this in my hands. The buttons are shifting around from side to side, and it ends up making a small rattling noise. The original is completely silent, whereas this one makes sounds that make the entire console feel cheaper than it otherwise would be if this was silent. They really need to start paying attention to stuff like this. We only have a few other buttons to go over for input. We have power and reset on the side. This thing does support some form of sleep mode, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. On the other side, we have a volume rocker that can also change the brightness with a hotkey. That just leaves us with start and select. These buttons are way louder than they are on the SP. The saving grace is that I don't need to use them enough to make this an issue for me. The last button that we have here is our menu button. This is normally the brightness toggle on a real SP. When it comes to my normal input testing, I'm not really having any significant issues firing off attacks in Street Fighter Third Strike. I'm sure with more practice on this, it would be even easier, especially if I end up modding the membrane that this uses down the line. All in all, it's pretty good. When it comes to the display, this seems to be using the same panel that was used in the RG35XX Plus, which was their last handheld that I reviewed. Some of the colors look a little different, but it could just come down to screen lottery. It is possible for people to have a worse RG35XX Plus screen than the one that I have here. I would be surprised if these are not the same underlying panel. Brightness levels on the Max also seem to be quite decent. They definitely overpower the GBA SP, and the colors on this new panel are fairly close to my Plus, which has one of the better screens that are currently out there in this size. The Plus screen has a bit more saturation, but again, the screen lottery is always a factor in this market. When it comes to the viewing angle tests, great image dead on with some slight distortion on the diagonals. The cardinal directions are all good, and those are the only ones that you'll ever need to use with this device. Your standard use should always have this screen looking sharp and amazing. Here's a minimum and maximum brightness comparison against original hardware. The SP is blown out of the water when we set the RG SP to the max level. This one is much better for outdoor use. Now these devices come with a Wi-Fi chip, I think it's this one right here, and this has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth capabilities. I want to showcase the wireless co-op support that this has. This is something that you can do on many other devices, but this form factor is awesome for pick up and play two-player gaming. This process isn't really that complicated. We're going to start by booting into RA on both of these. And once we're in here, we need to boot up a game to use with NetPlay. On our second device, we should be able to use the refresh list option to find our other device. If we press on that, it should load, but if it doesn't, we need to manually load it up before we can use that option. And as you can see, it took a little while for that to happen, but now both of these are configured to be running the same game at the same time. You'll see that each device is identified as either player 1 or player 2. It's that simple. I'm playing this from a hotspot right now, and this should be a decent experience for you as long as you have a good Wi-Fi signal for both devices to use. I believe now that we've already loaded up the game one time, we should be able to just refresh this list, select a game from here, and then it should sync up. So as long as you do that manual process one time, if you want to play it again in the future, then you'll be fine. So if you want to play this with someone that's younger that won't be able to navigate those menus, just do it once on your own and then you'll be good to go. The RG SP also comes with Bluetooth controller support. There's one thing that you have to do if you want to use it. By default, it will turn a Bluetooth controller into a second controller. To fix this, I went down to the controller options and then I set the second controller to be mapped to port 1. You can then switch the onboard controls to port 2. After that, it works fine. The RG SP also has video out support, but it's important to note that it doesn't support hot plug. You'll see here that it's plugged in, but it doesn't work. If I go ahead and I reset this, the video signal will eventually go to the external display. You'll notice that the video is in 16:9 to match the screen that I'm using. The only bad part about this console experience is that I don't seem to be able to control this menu using my Bluetooth controller, or at least I can't use all of the buttons. I can go in a menu and then back out, but not much else. The buttons on the RG SP still work in this mode, so I can use that to help get by this issue for now. This HDMI out support is kind of cool because it opens up a few more doors for us. For one, it sends the resolution to the emulator that we're going to be using. So those games will all run in 16:9 with a different set of borders applied. As you can see, we now have GBA borders on the left and the right side, whereas before we only had one on the bottom. The strange thing about RA is that it seems to be stretched from 4:3 instead of being native 16:9. This console experience does have a few quirks. For one, SNES was kind of borked. The image isn't centered, and it's kind of strange to see this when the rest of this was pretty well put together. I have a feeling it probably has something to do with these settings, especially this X setting here. Here you can see that it's at 144. That's completely off. I don't know what they were using to reference this, but that does not center this image on a 16:9 display. Genesis seems just fine. Again, this doesn't support hot plugs, so you will need to do a full reboot to go back to handheld mode. One of the cool things that I can now do is test input latency against real hardware. In this example, I have the Mr. FPGA board that I talked about on my second channel, and right now, this is being programmed to act as a Mega Drive or a Genesis. I have the same controller that I was using before in the Bluetooth test. This is wired up by USB with a 1000 Hz polling rate, and we have Sonic 1 running on both of these. And what we're going to do is press and hold the jump button on both of these at the same time to look for some variation. Future Taki here. After reviewing this in post, we seem to be within one frame from the Mister at any given time, which is good to see. Let's do a sound test of the speaker that we have here. We only have a mono speaker, but we do have audio out. This is about as good as you can expect a mono speaker to be. It doesn't have a lot of bass to it, and it also doesn't get that loud at the highest volume, but it's more than serviceable if you don't have headphones. One thing that I know a couple of people are going to be interested in is whether or not this hinge is going to hold up. The GBA hinge is pretty decent, as are the DS models. They can break, but we have seen much worse on clamshell handhelds in this market, especially on the higher end with ones that can crack the plastic shell from stress. From what I can see, they seem to be using dual hinges on this, where you have one on either side with the display ribbon cable rolled up in the center. With the SP, the entire opening is smooth up to the click position. You can go a bit further than this, but this is where you'll typically be at. Not a lot of stress from the shell, and it feels like this is going to hold up for a very long time. On the RG SP, it's not exactly the same. It's smooth up to around 45 degrees or so, and then you need a bit more force to go further than that. You can also push it back more than the clicked in position. When I'm using this, I don't feel like I'm putting a lot of strain on the shell. The end does bounce a bit more than I would like. That's really the only thing that's jumping out at me right now. We would need to put in a lot more hours from a lot of other people to see if this holds up. On the manufacturing side, you can get robots that will simulate thousands of movements like this nonstop to validate the part. I would assume that Anbernic did this for this device because the testing isn't that expensive and most factories can do it if you ask. I hope this holds up for at least a year because we've seen these go on other devices in weeks or days. As long as the company honors their warranty, then there's no issues on my side. Given our small size, I think it's also important to talk about the thermals. With a package this small, there are not a lot of options for where to put your processor. Anbernic is kind of guilty to a fault for always using their batteries as a heatsink in the absence of using a real heatsink. To their credit in this situation, Nintendo did the same thing on the GBA SP. The battery is very close to the CPU on the SP, but the difference is the GBA SP doesn't get that hot at all. This one also doesn't get that hot playing GBA games, but this has way more performance under the hood, so I want to look at how it fares. With the thermal camera, we can see that the GBA in the corner measuring in at 32 Celsius, which is less than your body temperature. You will warm up the GBA SP instead of the SP warming up you. On the RG SP, we have a hotspot near our input buttons of around 41 Celsius, and you can see the surface area is going to be a bit over normal skin temp. The backlight seems to be pretty good at around 37 Celsius, and this hotspot shows us that this should be a native landscape display. The back of the GBA SP sits at 33 Celsius, while the same area on the RG SP is again a bit over skin temp, and the battery is soaking up all of that heat that the processor is generating. I want to see what this looks like on the high end with God of War for the PSP. I'm going to let both of these heat up for around 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to check back with the thermal camera. After that, we have a hotspot near the Y button at around 48 Celsius with center temps at 44 Celsius and a D-pad at 42 Celsius. Not terrible. On the other side, our hotspot is a bit lower at 45 Celsius versus 48, but you will see that the entire surface is completely different, and this difference has to come down to the differences in the plastic composition. The middle is at 40 Celsius and the D-pad comes in at 42 like the other. Edge temps are better as well. Let's start on the left side with the back. We have a hotspot of 42.3 Celsius, and again, that's being dumped into the battery. The center temp sits at 38 Celsius, which isn't that bad for PSP. On the other one, it is way worse. We have consistent temps across the entire battery at 43 Celsius. With the back cover off, we can get a better idea of how these both compare. I want to take the battery out on both of these to get a better idea of what the processor temps are. With those out, we can see a reading at the top of the die at 69 Celsius, which is what I would expect based on my previous testing. This processor can get pretty toasty, and it's not that it doesn't need a heatsink. It definitely could use one, but there are not a lot of options for this package. Nintendo put a piece of plastic between the processor and the battery, but even if they didn't, it wouldn't really be an issue because the processor doesn't generate like any heat. Anbernic has a cutout over the processor without any plastic, and the battery just sits above it. There is probably like a 3 to 5 millimeter gap between the bottom of the battery and the top of the processor. From left to right, we have PSP Emulation at 69 Celsius, GBA Emulation at 53 Celsius, and a real GBA that is less than the surface temp of your skin. A lot of people want to know if these devices support proper PD charging, and usually that's not the case with Anbernic devices. They can charge from a USB-A to C cable, and sometimes they can do C to C, but it's not universal. I have some stuff here to show how this looks. On the RG Plus and a normal Type-C to Type-C, we can't charge. And if we plug this into the FP-GBC, I can charge, but on the RG SP, I can't. I feel like they really need to get on top of this because they've been selling devices for years that can't charge like this, and it shouldn't be a money thing because this is even supported on no-name devices that are cheaper than the SP, like this one here. It's kind of lazy that they haven't already implemented this. Make it possible for them to also charge with Type-C to Type-C chargers. In this section, we're going to talk all about the software. I have a couple of important things that I want to showcase in this section, some of which has already come up while I was filming other parts of this video. This is going to be all about the stock software. Right now, the software is good enough to get you by, but it is rough enough to leave you excited if and when Anbernic provides updates to it. As I've been making this video, I've been passing along feedback about all of the bugs that I've found while using it. This is usually my approach when I have a device pre-release. The default OS gives us a system that is easy enough for people to use that are completely new to these kinds of devices. We have this game room window right here, but there's something that I want to point out about this that I don't see mentioned in other places. Sometimes devices like these have issues that people like me should know how to fix or know to avoid. I'm going to tell you right now, this game room section is pretty crap, and I would never use it over the other options that are here. But if I was to just review this product with that game room menu alone, this would be a very different review video. I can showcase this by loading up a GB game. Funny enough, this device is cloned after the GBA SP almost to a T, but the most important Nintendo games were taken out of the included ROMs that this ships with. You will see that there are no Mario games in the default system. Nintendo has started to take legal action against Chinese companies that sell stuff like this, so that probably explains why. Anyway, here's Super Mario Land. The picture looks pretty crap, and if we go into the menu options, we can see that it's already set to aspect ratio. Let me turn on the overlay. Now it's a bit better. But when it comes to actually playing a game that is this light, the frame pacing is all over the place, and the emulation is super choppy. If we zoom in, it should be very obvious why I don't recommend people to use this menu, and why I wouldn't review this device using it. Super Nintendo also has issues with the game room menu. It seems like there's some occasional frame skipping going on that looks pretty bad when it happens. The RA menu is worth using, and it is also easy to use. It allows you to select the SD card that you want to pull games from, and it separates all of your ROMs behind system icons. The only issue that I have with the stock experience is that you can't page scroll with the shoulder buttons. On other devices you can, but you can only use left or right on the D-pad, and that button isn't as easy to quickly press as R1 or L1. Those should be supported for something like this. I never use favorites, history, or search. The App Center doesn't have anything that I care too much about, but they do have some useful scripts that can be useful in some situations. In the settings menu, you can see my version build date. Everything that I talk about in this section of the video goes with this version. Some things may break in the future that aren't broken here, or may be improved. It does go both ways. I recommend increasing the sleep time above 1 minute if you end up getting this. We already talked about the brightness, and I leave this at 5 all the time. The RA menu is where I spend most of my time, and that's what you'll need to use if you want to launch into RA without a game. Moonlight is the only thing that we didn't touch on in this video, and I don't really think that I would use Moonlight on this at all. There are way better devices out there for game streaming than this, and I would only ever use Moonlight for memes. We do not have enough input options on this to make streaming viable. Your customization options are pretty limited at this point in time. You can change your icons and the background picture. That's about it. What I want you to take away is there's a lot of room in here for Anbernic to come in here and improve the experience so it at least matches what they were offering in their other products. By the way, turn off the button sound when you get this. That thing should never exist. It makes this sound like a cheap MP4 player from the early 2000s. There are a few software issues at this point in time. One is a stuttering issue that impacts a few systems that I like. I am hopeful that the company will fix that issue going forward. The second biggest issue for me is that sleep mode doesn't consistently work that well, and in some cases, the buttons just don't work at all when you wake up from sleep, forcing you to do a hard reboot. This ended up happening to me on camera, so I have the footage, but there were many other cases while using this where I couldn't really trust that sleep was working well at all. I almost never want to use this. It should just be as easy as a single press on the power button. You'll feel vibration, and then screen and activity light will cut out. When you press the button again, it will reboot back into the game if you had one loaded up at that time. I need to check, but I don't think this processor supports real deep sleep-like phones. Also, the loading times of breaking out of games is a little excessive for a Linux handheld. Anyway, here's a GBA game so we can test. I'll press the power button to put it into sleep. If I press the power button again, it reboots. This is uncut just to give you an idea of how long this actually takes to get back up and running. It is in no way how your phone works or how real sleep works on other handhelds. This is more like Hibernate on a PC than anything else. When it does work, it props you back into a game, but it also sets your brightness to the lowest level. You have to use a hotkey to adjust it back to how it was. That's definitely a little wonky. Anyway, I hope the frame pacing issues and the sleep mode are improved in future updates, as well as some other stuff that came up in this video already. This device does support third-party OSs, and this is one of the best out of the bunch in terms of solving the issues that the stock system has. It also has a UI that is very similar to what you'll find on more expensive handhelds, and learning it here will allow you to easily transition over to other handhelds in the future. There is a lot of customization available to you here, but there is also a few things that could be improved from the user experience. Hotkeys aren't set to the best thing that they could, and there's some inconsistencies in the functions of certain buttons in and out of an emulator. Ideally, this would support a standard Windows file storage partition by default like the image that Anbernic provides, and it would become the default upgrade path over the stock OS for anyone that wants something more. The best part of this is that it has sleep mode that is closer to what you would expect. It seems like it's just shutting off the screen and cutting out the sound, but the device is still awake. I would need to check what the CPU is doing in this mode. I think this is closer to what people would like for the stock OS experience. Let's now jump into some performance testing with handheld systems first. Here we have GB, GBC, Game Gear, Neo Geo Pocket, and WonderSwan Color. GBA is also amazing on this handheld, and this is a valid use case for this device. Even if you only want to play GBA games, this is a great experience. Thermals aren't bad, and the battery life is much better than you would expect. More on that later. The best part about GBA emulation on this compared to original hardware is the option to fast forward. This is great for grindy games like Pokemon. Nintendo DS is also possible on this. Personally, I wouldn't use this to play DS games because I already own many DS handhelds that do a much better job. If you're wondering how you get around not having two screens, you can toggle between different views with the shoulder buttons. That being said, it works the best if you have a game that doesn't need to use the second screen that often or at all. PSP is another system that I wouldn't play on this. By default, all of your games will be stretched out, and you'll have some performance issues with the stock settings. They ship this with Chains of Olympus, but they use very bad settings, like having VSync disabled. With some tweaking, we can get it to run a bit better. Let's now move over to home consoles with NES and Super Nintendo. If you use the RA game menu, you'll have borders on the sides of your screen. It's up to you which route you want to go with. In some cases, I'd rather have the games fill out the entire screen to make it easier to see what I'm doing or what characters are saying. SNES is my favorite console of this generation, and this handheld is a good option if Anbernic ever fixes the stuttering issues that this system has. Let's keep things going with Genesis and the 32X. When it comes to PS1, we're going to want to go over into the settings and turn on the enhanced resolution option. That will improve the visuals of 3D games, and it's an easy recommendation. Dreamcast isn't terrible on this handheld. There are some games that need to use frame skipping to get by. The biggest con is obviously the fact that we don't have an analog stick.
Some barrels contain items. Extra speed.
As you can imagine, that carries over to N64. By default, this is set to 240p, which is a little low for this processor. When we try to bump up to 480p, games run too slow, and I don't think it's worth tinkering on a game-by-game basis with this current software. Not having an analog stick isn't great for Nintendo 64 games, and there are probably just as many that you wouldn't even want to bother with on the SP. Keep in mind that you always have the option of doing video out with an external controller, and that becomes a compelling option, especially if 480p rendering is possible in the future.
Lap 2.
That's going to be it for the performance tests. Before going into the pros and cons, I have some battery life data to go over. I did full battery drains on 2 systems to give you an idea of what you can expect. These were 100% to 0 battery drains at 100% brightness and should be reflective of what you can get on your own. On the low end in terms of emulation, we have GBA Emulation coming in at 9 hours of battery life, which is amazing. I also did a stress test of Chains of Olympus. The device didn't die before this video went up, so make sure to look at the pinned comment to see when it actually did die. Let's move over to the pros and cons. For pros, I think this is a good clone. Other devices that have tried to do this use processors that couldn't even run GBA games well, let alone anything else. They also came with screen tearing, which is a non-starter. This one has a good processor, and it can also play GBA games. The screen is also one of the better 3.5-inch screens on the market today, and is a huge upgrade from even the best stock GBA screen. The battery life is also very good. For cons, I only have a few. The membrane material that they're using could be a bit softer or shorter. I'd take either, to be honest. The software is a little rough right now, and I'd like to see the issues that came up for me addressed over the next few weeks or so. And thermals are a bit high on the high end. This isn't an issue for the games that I want to play on this, but it is worth mentioning here. And that's it. I want to wrap up this video with some recommendations. I've been waiting a long time for a company to recreate the GBA SP. I plan on eventually getting around to doing this, and I would have done a lot of the same things that Anbernic did here. I like the GBA SP. I've been saying that for years. I'd also be willing to pay a lot more to get the same experience that this current version provides. In my opinion, this is a $100 product that is selling for $60, even if you only care about GBA emulation. Game Boy Advance SP units are incredibly expensive where I live, especially if they have an AGS 101 screen. This device will get you 90% of the way to that nostalgia, with the added benefit that it can play way more systems than the GBA can. It's an easy recommendation from me. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see another, take a look at my video on the GBA SP in 2021. Happy gaming, everyone. Taki out.